Thank you, Matthew, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I must say, to start off, it is fabulous to see a packed hall, really wonderful, and I think it tells us all just how important and how topical the issue of interfaith dialogue is, and my goodness, we have got a wonderful speaker to present to us and talk to us tonight in Karen. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Karen in a moment. Before I do that, I'm just going to reflect for just a short moment on my own perspective on interfaith dialogue and the importance of it. Matthew was just saying, you know, my background, before I took over as the sort of attack dog on Hard Talk, barking and yelping at the politicians and sort of trying to challenge and ask rigorous questions of people in power, which is my day job now. For many years before that day job, I was a BBC foreign correspondent. And just to give you a flavor of what I did and how I think it does have a relevance for tonight's discussion and what we're going to hear from Karen, I'll just sort of run through sort of where I lived, what I did, and the connections to tonight. I was first based as a BBC foreign correspondent in Cairo, at a time, actually, in the early 1990s, when a wave of militant Islamism was sweeping through Egypt. And actually, as I arrived, the first Westerners were being attacked by the group Jamaat al-Islamiyya, who had decided that striking at Westerners was an effective way of sort of waging their own particular jihad against the government of Hosni Mubarak. So it was a time of tension in Cairo for Westerners. And it was interesting for me because I came to Cairo with an Arab wife, an Arab Christian wife. And we saw the changes in Egypt develop as we lived there for 3 years, at which point I got a call from my BBC bosses telling me that they wanted me to move to Jerusalem. So the notion of sort of dealing with the realities of tensions and difficulties between faith communities certainly became even more real. You can imagine my wife, for a moment, was somewhat taken aback at the idea of going to live in West Jerusalem, Jewish West Jerusalem, as an Arab. But we did it, and we had the most fascinating 3 years living in Israel with friends amongst both the Israeli Jewish population and the Palestinian Arab population, both Muslim and Christian. And it was the most fascinating and privileged existence in many ways, to be able to cut through some of the suspicions, the mistrust, and even the hatred that there is, most obviously there is, in Jerusalem, and reach out to people from all of the different sides of that conflict. But I have to say, it was also a very difficult time. It ended with us sort of living through the first wave of suicide bomb attacks in Jerusalem and in Israel, and it left, I'm afraid, with both my wife and I very depressed about the direction of travel for dialogue, for engagement between faith communities in Israel, and unfortunately that trajectory, I'm afraid, hasn't really changed. In many ways, it's got worse. And then finally, to wrap up this sort of life that is very much connected to everything we're going to talk about tonight, I went to Washington. And I was in the United States and reporting for the BBC on 9/11 and in the weeks and months and the year after 9/11. And again, a fascinating insight into the way religion and politics and communal suspicions have run up against each other. You know, a Bush administration at the time who declared that you are either with us or against us, intellectuals and ideologues declaring that there was a clash of civilizations, something again that has fed into our perceptions of what it means to be a member of a faith community and how we identify ourselves through politics and religion all mixed up together. So these are themes that obviously matter to the world we live in today, Engagement and dialogue and understanding and compassion are key words, I think, in the vocabulary of Karen Armstrong. And it is a very great pleasure for me to introduce you to Karen tonight. I was amazed to learn a couple of things about her just in the last few minutes. One, she's written more than 20 books. I mean, having written one book, and thank you for mentioning it, Matthew, because very few people have ever seen it. Having written one book and remembering what a god-awful effort it was to have produced more than 20 is really stunning, so well done, Karen, for that. But even more incredibly, as far as I'm concerned as a broadcaster, Karen is here tonight having spent, about 9 hours recording her latest book, of which I've got a copy just there on the table, The Case for God. Karen's putting that down as an audio book, and it is, as you can probably just see if you can see the book, it's not a short book. And in a week, she's got to get the whole thing on tape as an audio book. So she's had 9 hours of talking into a microphone today, and yet she's still raring to go tonight. So hats off to her for that. Her life story is incredible. She is a former Catholic nun, as I'm sure many of you know. 2 books came out of her experience as a nun in the convent, where she had 7 years before she left. Her spirituality took her in another direction. She, as I say, has very recently written a book which, in a sense, is how can I put it, a response to Richard Dawkins, a man actually who I had on Hard Talk not long ago and had a very fiery exchange with. But it's been a bestseller around the world. She is, I think it's fair to say, a very powerful voice when it comes to religious communities trying to engage, to have a dialogue, to understand each other. And she has founded something which I believe she's going to talk about a little bit, the Charter for Compassion. So there is an awful lot to Karen Armstrong. She's going to try and squeeze as much as she can of that into the next 25 minutes or so, and I shall leave the floor to her now. So Karen, if you would, please step forward.
Jerusalem was absolutely pivotal in my own religious development. I left my convent in a state of distress and grief and depression, and I thought I wanted nothing ever to do with religion again. And I after a number of career disasters, I finished in television. I said that to Bill Moyers, the American broadcaster, once, and he said, "Oh, we take anybody."
Well, look at the evidence.
Now, I was asked to write and present a 6-part documentary on St. Paul in the early 1980s, working with an Israeli film company. And I went out there knowing a little bit about St. Paul, and it was going to be a very skeptical program. But in Jerusalem, my life got turned around, because there I discovered for the first time Judaism and Islam. Because of my rather parochial Roman Catholic upbringing, I'd never really thought about Judaism as anything but a kind of prelude to Christianity. And I hadn't given Islam much of a thought. But working and living in Jerusalem, and I went back and forth for several years on this and other projects, you become powerfully aware not just of the conflict between the faiths, but of the profound connection between them. And I began to start studying these 3 Abrahamic faiths in tandem, developing what I wanted to call triple vision, where you look at the aspirations and theology and history of these faiths side by side. And it was actually the study of these 2 other traditions that brought me back to religion, that introduced me to a whole range of religious themes and imperatives that were new to me. And that was just the beginning of a long quest. And of course, it was also a city of conflict. And I went out there not knowing anything about the Arab-Israeli conflict. But when you're living in a city that is being torn apart in this way, people talk about it all the time and you're drawn into it. And I soon found it just wasn't between Arabs and Israelis. We British were there too. I began to see what it was a bit like to be Jewish, because some of my Israeli friends would say, well, you know, Karen, I don't want to offend you, some of my best friends are British, but, and then launch forth. And I began to realize that we were locked together in a three-sided conflict of pain. And so now, today, of course, things have moved on and they've become worse. And so much of our world is in turmoil and in meltdown. So many of the policies that we've been pursuing politically, internationally, financially, environmentally, are shown to be not sustainable. And sadly, the religions, which should be a major part in helping human beings to find a solution, are seen widely as part of the problem. During the 20th century, in every single major tradition, a militant or defensive piety, often given the unsatisfactory name of fundamentalism, has developed in every single one of them. It's a rebellion against secular modernity. In every region of the world where a modern secular style government which separates religion and politics on the Western model has been established, a Western countercultural protest movement that takes a religious form has developed in conscious, principled reaction. And every single one of these movements that I've studied in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is rooted in a profound fear. Every single one of these movements is convinced that modern, liberal, secular establishment wants to wipe out faith. And this is not always paranoid. If you think that in the Jewish tradition, fundamentalism took two giant steps forward, one after the Nazi Holocaust, when Hitler had tried to exterminate European Jewry, and the other after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when the Arabs took Israel by surprise and made a much better showing on the battlefield. And in the Muslim world, modernization and secularization has been so rapid and so accelerated. They didn't have the 300 years that we had to develop our secular democratic institutions, that it was often felt, secularism and modernity was felt to be lethal and invasive. The Shahs used to go out, send their soldiers out with their bayonets, taking off the women's veils and ripping them to pieces in front of them in the street. In 1935, Shah Reza Pahlavi gave his soldiers to shoot at hundreds of unarmed demonstrators who were peacefully protesting in one of the holiest shrines of Iran against obligatory Western clothes. These reformers wanted their countries to look modern. Never mind the fact that a vast number of the population had no understanding of the new Western ideas that were being incarnated in their country. And hundreds of Iranians were killed that day. Now, in that kind of context, modernity and democracy and all the things that we Westerners love is not seen as liberal and benign, but as really dangerous and perilous. Even in small-town America, people feel colonized by what is to them the alien ethos of Washington, Yale, or Harvard. Now, one of the things why fundamentalism, as it can be called, is an unsatisfactory form of faith is that it denies important principles enshrined in all the major traditions. And it is very important, I think, that we go back and look at these two principles that all the traditions would agree upon. I'm not saying that all the religions are the same. They're not. Each one has its peculiar genius and its particular flaws and failings. But on these two principles, they would all agree. All would insist, at base, that the reality that we call God, or nirvana, or Brahman, or Tao, is beyond human fathoming. Jews, for example, refuse to speak the name of God out of reverence, because any human expression of the divine is liable to be so inadequate that it's almost blasphemous. And for centuries, this is what this new book is about, in the Christian world, major carriers of the Christian tradition, such as Thomas Aquinas, insisted that we cannot say what we mean by God. We know what God is. We come to appreciate God, but God is transcendent. And very often religious people say, yes, I know God is transcendent, but we know what he means. And all too often, people speak about God as though he was their boss or some kind of eminence grise whose behavior and likes and dislikes can be predicted. Now, the Crusaders in the Middle Ages went into battle to fight Muslims and Jews with the battle cry, God wills it. Now, obviously, God, whatever God is, meant no such thing. But the Crusaders were simply projecting their own fears, desires, and loathing onto a deity that they'd created in their own image and likeness, and making it give a divine seal of absolute approval to their own nefarious policies. And extremists are doing this today. This is idolatry. Idolatry means not just bowing down in front of a statue, but raising what is essentially finite to an absolute level. And because there can only be one absolute, people who follow this kind of idol often have to destroy anything that threatens it. And it's not just religious people who create idols. Nationalism can become a great idol too. Now, so what in their fear, fundamentalists often deny the compassion that lies at the heart of all these faiths. So, first of all, so these are the two principles. Ineffability. When we speak about God, we don't know what we are talking about. And that's not just a giving up in despair, because we are people who seek transcendence. That's what religion is about. Our minds are so constituted that we endlessly seek out experiences that take us beyond what we can easily conceive and know. When we feel touched deeply within and lifted momentarily beyond ourselves, feel that we inhabit our humanity more fully than usual, and that all will ultimately be well, even though we cannot explain this rationally. Music is indeed in one sense, a very rational art. It's based on mathematics, but it segues very easily into transcendence. It takes you into a place where words and concepts are not operable, but where there is numinous meaning. And that's what the religions are supposed to do. That's what theology is supposed to do. Theology should open us up to wonder. And so they used to say that the best way of approaching God is not through a lot of wordy disputes, but in silence, Confucius used to say, "Oh, I wish I did not need to speak." And his disciples said, "Oh, well, but Master, if you didn't speak to us, how would we poor little ones know anything about you?" And Confucius said, "Heaven, the high god of China, heaven does not speak. But look how effective heaven is. Because of heaven, the constellations wheel on their courses, the myriad things come into being and pass away. The seasons follow one another, but heaven does no speaking." And his implication was that if we could stop all our theological chatter and disputes, we too might be as effective as heaven. Because when we speak about what we call God, nobody has the last word. Allahu Akbar, the Muslims say. God is always greater than anything that we can conceive. And so that's, first of all, a humble acceptance that the dogmatism that people often associate with religion is really out of place. We are all in confronting transcendence and mystery. So we should listen to one another's insights about this, not saying, "You are wrong." But is there no break on the way? Is there no limit on the number of theologies that we can create? Is there no principle that makes one of them better than another? Yes. All the world religions insist, and here they're all at one, that the real test of any religious idea, any spirituality, is that it must lead to practical compassion. Others would say that it's compassion that leads you to the divine. Compassion does not mean to feel sorry for people, to feel pity for people. I think we're so uneducated in compassion these days that distinction is often lost. I was giving a lecture in Holland last year, and I made this point: compassion does not mean feeling sorry for people. And yet when my speech was translated in the Dutch newspaper, every time I said compassion, it was translated pity. So compassion means to feel or experience with the other person, to put yourself into the position of another. And it's encapsulated in what's been called the Golden Rule, which has been formulated in every single one of the major traditions. I'll give the Jewish and Confucian one form here. Do not do to others what you would not like them to do to you. Look into your own heart. Discover what it is that gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict this pain on anybody else. And why they've insisted on compassion is not just because it sounds good or edifying, but because it's been found to work. Everybody knows that what holds us back from the divine and our best selves is ego. Me, mine. It's ego that makes us aggressive, filled with hatred, impatient of others. But compassion demands that you dethrone yourself from the center of your world and put another there. And Confucius said, you do it all day and every day. It's not a question of, as we often say, well, that's my good deed for the day. Right, that's it. Now I can return to uncompassionate living. All day and every day you dethrone yourself and put another there. And the traditions all insist that you cannot confine your benevolence to your own group. You have to have what one of the Chinese sages called yan'ai, concern for everybody. Honor the stranger, says Leviticus. If a stranger lives with you in your land, do not molest him. You must love him as one of your own people and treat him as yourself. For you were strangers in Egypt. The same empathy. Remember your sufferings in Egypt, and then don't inflict that on the strangers in your midst. Love your enemies, said Jesus. Put your benevolence where there is no hope of any concern. And love, as it's used in these texts, is not meaning a kind of sloppy sort of tenderness which you could whip up from time to time. Leviticus is a legal text, and so emotional terms would be quite out of place. Love, the word love, was a legal term used in international treaties that told you that when two kings made a treaty together, they promised to love each other. That didn't mean they had to become best friends, but they had to look out for each other's interests, give them practical support and absolute loyalty. And we can all do, even for the people we think of as enemies. And in the Quran, one's constantly, we're told, O people, we have formed you into tribes and nations so that you may know one another. Not so that you may exploit or conquer or colonize or convert or kill, but so that you may know one another, get to know one another. And that means getting rid of all those prejudices and getting to know one another. And this is a spiritual process, because as we knock down those prejudices that we have, we're getting rid of those barricades that we protect our shrinking, frightened ego. When I won a prize last year and was given a wish for a better world, this was not the moment to ask for a villa in the Bahamas. I felt what a pity. I thought immediately what I wanted to do, because what a pity it is how rarely you hear religious people when they come together speaking of compassion, which is at the core of religious life. So in my charter, I asked the people who gave me the prize to help me to craft a charter for compassion that would be created with leading thinkers in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, and that would be signed by 1,000 leaders worldwide, and that would be propagated in a way that was as important as all the, given the same kind of coverage as the terrorism that we have. And we're still working on this. We had a wonderful meeting of my council in Switzerland, a nice neutral place. We had some rabbis, we had Confucians, Buddhists, Hindus, many Muslims. The Grand Mufti of Egypt came, people from Pakistan, a wonderful young pop star from Pakistan. And we're creating this charter now. It's going to be short, not one of these great wordy documents, 200 or 300 words. And we're having the big launch in November. I can't tell you any more about either the charter or the launch because it's still all in the planning stage. But the idea is that on that day, in 5 or 6 cities, the charter will be inscribed on glass plaques, will be put up simultaneously in churches, synagogues, mosques, temples in India, Pakistan, Middle East, Latin America, South Africa, New York, even London.